Hello again, it's Steve Smith here, and this is another presentation in my series of CPD sessions, and this one today is about grammar. There's my Twitter handle at the bottom there, sbsmith45. That's my blog, FrenchTeacherNet.blogspot.com, and I'd like to recommend InformedLanguageTeacher.com with all sorts of readings, videos, and podcasts about research and language teaching. So, grammar, the G word. Are you ready for this? I hope you've got your glass of Pinot Grigio or a nice coffee or tea ready. This is going to be a bit more of a theoretical one, and some of the more practical suggestions around teaching grammar will come in subsequent videos. So here we go. Firstly, it's worth saying that grammar is one of those things that teachers talk about a lot. They ask questions like, how much grammar should I teach? How should I teach it? Should I get students to conjugate verbs? Should I teach a grammar rule first and then practice it? Or should they see grammar rules in text and discover them for themselves? Should I teach tenses in a certain order, for example, starting from present and then working through others year by year? So there are all sorts of issues to do with grammar teaching, and much of this is bound up with tradition, because certainly if you're an older teacher, you would have been brought up with a way of teaching based on a grammatical syllabus. So the point of today's presentation is to get you to think about these issues and hopefully come to some conclusions for yourself about the role of grammar in your own particular context. Now, first of all, I just want to point out here a distinction that perhaps not everyone will be aware of, and that's the one here between pedagogical grammar and what you might call internalized grammar. Now, pedagogical grammar is the sort of grammar that you'd find in the back of a textbook. It's the rules of the language that you're familiar with. That's not at all the same as what's going on in our head, our internalized grammar. In fact, what's going on in our head is rather mysterious and has very little to do with the grammar rules that we teach. So I think one idea to dispel straight away is that what we teach children in terms of grammar in a lesson is what ends up in their heads. It isn't that way at all. And a second point I want to pick up is there are two fundamentally different views about how we acquire grammar, both the grammar of our first language and our second languages. For a long time, it was the ideas of Noam Chomsky up here that have held sway. And his view was, if I can try and express this correctly, that every human being has an inbuilt language acquisition device. We are kind of genetically pre-programmed to learn languages, both first and other languages. Learning a language is like it's like walking or being able to catch something. It's just natural. It's built into us. And Chomsky took that further to say that actually we even have within our brains, if you like, constraints on the sort of rules that apply across languages, and that you can find commonalities at a very deep level across all languages. And for quite a while, that wasn't greatly questioned, that view. In more recent years, something called, often the term used is emergentism, takes a different view. It says that when we learn a language, our first or second language, actually, we're not using something which is unique in our brains that's designed for language learning. We're using our general learning mechanisms. So the sort of mechanisms that you would use, for example, if you were learning to ride a bike or learning to read, whatever it might be, they're the general sort of skills that we have which we apply to language learning. And that the rules of the language kind of emerge from our sampling of the huge amount of language data that we receive. So, for example, we'll hear lots of examples of certain chunks of language, we'll hear very few examples of others, and it might be because of that issue of frequency, we tend to recall the ones that we hear a lot and which are most useful to us. And gradually we build up a picture unconsciously of how all these chunks combine. So, from a teacher's point of view, that might not worry you too much, whether you think that Chomsky had it right or whether you think the emergentists had it right. But it is something to bear in mind that much of what we acquire about grammar happens beneath the radar. It happens subconsciously. So how do pupils acquire grammar? Well, Certainly, as I've said just now, unconsciously, what's called in psychology implicitly. So do they just pick up the rules of grammar like you do with your first language? So when you're a young child, no one teaches you any rules. You don't have to go and learn how to conjugate a verb. You just pick it up, don't you, with the huge amount of input that you receive. So certainly that ability persists, and adults can still acquire languages and pick up grammatical rules without paying attention to precisely what the rules are. A second view is that we can learn rules consciously. We can practice them and then gradually apply them to speech and to writing, and we learn the rules of grammar that way. So that second route, if you like, is an explicit way of learning grammar. It's conscious. It's the opposite of the implicit route. It's not the route that we use when we're learning a language as a young child, but it could play a much greater role when we're learning a second language as a school child or as an adult. Is it a possibility that actually we acquire grammar with a mixture of both of those routes? Well, most researchers would take the view that with second language learning, both routes do play a role. Although it has to be said, they would probably still favour implicit learning as the main mechanism. But much depends on the context. So, for example, if you're working in a school with only a couple of hours a week, you're not likely to get the large amounts of input you need to be able to acquire grammatical rules implicitly. You need to try and take some sort of shortcut and make a choice about which grammar to practice. Now, this raises a very interesting theoretical point, and this is the idea of the interface. In other words, is it possible for rules that we've learnt, that we've practiced, for those to become implicit, to be part of long-term memory and accessible for instant recall? So in other words, can we practice the skill and can it then become what's called procedural memory? In other words, can it go from being declarative memory to procedural memory? And that's a big, big debate and has been for many years in the literature. Some people feel that there is no interface, that what we learn explicitly cannot become implicit, unconscious knowledge. Some take a view that actually everything in certain circumstances that we practice could become unconsciously known procedural. So, as I mentioned, context is important here, and if you're a teacher working on limited time, it's likely that you're going to feel that conscious learning, application of rules and practice is going to play a greater role. So, the evidence for this unconscious acquisition, well, as I've mentioned, it comes from first language acquisition. It also stems from an idea which is known in the literature as poverty of the stimulus. This is the idea that you can create an infinite number of sentences on limited means. So, for example, we will all come up with sentences at some point that we've never heard. So we can, from our input, have a certain amount of data, and then unconsciously our brains work with that data and enable us to produce new sentences that we've never heard before. Some people use that as an argument for the idea of Chomsky's universal grammar, that ultimately we need more than just to analyze data. Something needs to happen in our brain that's creative, that allows us to create new sentences. If you're a teacher who's taken students abroad on some sort of study trip or on a student exchange, you'll know how powerful the immersion effect is. And that may have been your own experience, for example, if you lived in a different country for a while and then saw your fluency and comprehension improve tenfold just by being immersed and without having rules explained. So, we know how powerful input is. On the other hand, the evidence for skill acquisition then, if you like, the more conscious route of learning then, well, from the research literature, there was a very famous meta-study, a sort of study of lots of other studies carried out by Norris and Ortega back in 2000, which concluded from all the data that when there were grammar explanations and opportunities for controlled practice, then people became more accurate. In addition, all the research coming out from cognitive learning science about working memory, long-term memory, forgetting rates and so on, which I'll talk about another time, might suggest that simply by practicing a skill over and over, it can find its way into long-term memory. And there are scholars who do support the idea of skill acquisition. For example, Robert de Keyser there on the left and Ronald P. Liao on the right, who reckon that in some circumstances at least, explicit teaching can play an important role. I should add that since the very famous Norris and Ortega study, which is much quoted, there have been one or two more recent studies just in the last 3 or 4 years that have called that study into question. So overall then, as a teacher, what could you draw from this research? Well, certainly, I think we have to keep in mind the primacy of comprehensible input and the implicit route. And it might be that you don't see the results of this in the early stages, but if I can be somewhat anecdotal, when I've taught children over a period of, say, 7 years, by the 6th and 7th year, my strong feeling is that what's making them get better is the immersion in the language. It's just the interaction with comprehensible input. You can also, from research, you have to recognize that traditional grammar teaching has serious weaknesses, which I'll talk about in a moment. These are to do with how learnable grammar actually is, and something to do with natural orders of acquisition. Let me explain that. So when you're a child learning, it appears that we tend to pick up certain forms of the language, notably morphemes, word endings, in a very particular order, and it's quite predictable. And research has been done back in the 70s and 80s that suggests that this also happens in the second language as well, and that what we teach may not correspond with a student's natural order of acquisition. We can draw also from research clearly how important repetition is, practice and interaction. And we know from the literature there is support for what's termed focus on form, some explicit teaching of the rules of grammar. That seems to help, particularly with accuracy. Now, there's a fellow called Robert Schmidt who came up with his noticing hypothesis, originally in 1990, and then that was developed further in 2001. And he said that for any acquisition of grammar to occur, you have to notice the form. He actually rode back a little bit on that by 2001, but the feeling is that if students don't notice something that's going on in the form of the language, they won't acquire that language, that grammatical form. And implicit learning takes a long time. So in the classroom, if we make sure that students notice grammatical forms, point them out, and map the meaning to the form, that will help. I mentioned in an earlier slide there learnability. You will have had this experience. Students don't seem to learn what we teach. So, you might be in your staff room and say, I've worked on this tense for 4 weeks and they still don't get it. I've done these object pronouns, they still don't seem to get it. Now, it might be that the students simply aren't ready. Even if they understand the rule in theory, they don't seem able to apply the rule. Some structures seem to be harder for students to acquire than others. Why is this? Well, it might be the implicit complexity of the structure. It's actually quite complicated. It's quite likely to be that it's unlike the structure in the first language. So, for example, in French, object pronouns go before the verb. In English, they go after. So it may not be surprising that students take a while before realizing that they've got to say, instead of I draw it, I it draw. They might understand the rule in theory, but to apply it takes a lot of time. I mentioned also the inbuilt natural orders of acquisition. It could be that if our teaching is going against that individual student's natural order, then they may not acquire the grammatical term, or the grammatical form, I should say. Frequency is important. If it's a very high frequency grammatical form, that might help. Is the grammatical form salient? i.e., is it noticeable? Is it recognizable? Does it seem important? That might be the sort of grammar that's acquired more easily than other sorts of grammar. And is it useful? Is that particular grammatical rule useful? So, for example, being able to change tense from present to past is pretty useful. Is making adjectives agree in inflectional languages useful? Well, it's for accuracy, but not really for communication. So adjective agreement is one of those cases where for English students, it doesn't seem salient because we don't have them in English. Why bother? It doesn't seem that useful. So perhaps no surprise that adjective agreement takes a while to get established. Natural orders, I mentioned, so a bit more about that then. This is the research that was done on the orders of acquisition of morphemes. So it seems predictable in L1, L2 seems to happen as well. Of course, you might be tempted to think, yeah, but if we knew that order, could we teach to it? Could we kind of marry in with the student's readiness? Well, that's pretty hard to do, partly because we don't know precisely what these orders are, and secondly, every student is different, and they're proceeding at a sort of different pace. They all have at any one point their own version of the second language, their interlanguage as it's called. So in practice, it's pretty hard to try and teach to the natural order. Now, in 2016, there was an important review carried out in England. It was called the Teaching Schools Council Review of MFL Pedagogy. And I just picked up a couple of quotations there to do with grammar and highlighted some key points for you. So, can I just ask you to read that first? To pick out a couple of essential points here, they did favour, from their observations of lessons, their discussions with teachers, and their trawl of the relevant research, they did support explicit, concise descriptions of grammar, but don't spend too long on it, as it were. They also concluded that sometimes it's better just to give a rule rather than wait for pupils to identify grammatical patterns. Your experience, like mine, might be that even with relatively highly proficient students, sometimes they don't spot the rule. They might not know what they're looking for. And in general, then, their support is for doing explicit grammar, but keeping it simple and maybe focusing on the aspects of grammar that are more achievable, that are simpler. And then they added this. This may not be so different to what you would normally do yourself, which depends on your own personal practice. But the point here is that practicing the grammar point in input language, so in other words, taking input as the starting point, so listening texts, reading texts, and then doing structured, controlled practice tasks which require the grammatical feature to be practiced, to be recognized and then practiced. They also make an argument for taking other contextual clues away. That's part of something that's called input processing, where if you, for example, let me try and explain this. If you gave as a prompt to a class, yesterday I went to the cinema. Now, to understand that, yesterday, the time marker, tells them already it's in the past. So in a sense, they don't need to process the verb I went to know that it's talking about the past. So the suggestion is that if you strip away the time marker and just took I went to the cinema, students have to process that verb to understand the time frame being used. So that could be an argument when you're drilling for taking away certain items so that you focus on the main point of grammar you're trying to practice. I've got to say, from a personal point of view, I don't see that as a major factor. You could even argue that having time markers there, for example, could actually aid and reinforce knowledge of tense. But that's something that has been researched. A key point there as well, I'd note from that slide, is that it does seem very often that textbooks and sometimes teachers jump straight from a formal explanation and get students to try and use the new grammar productively and in free writing and so on. And that can lead to very poor mastery. So the idea is that you show the grammar point in the input, lots of examples of it, explain the rule, practice it in very controlled ways before you eventually lead to freer production. And by the way, Emma Marsden over here, she's the professor at University of York who is kind of running, if you like, the National Centre for Excellence. She's the main scholarly input into that body. Do check out their website, ncelp.org. NCELP also make the case for practice, forced practice of the features being taught. So actually demand pushed output, get students to practice. And by process of practice, this supports the skill acquisition model of learning. You gradually automatize that skill so it becomes part of long-term memory. So practice, 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 as in any form of learning. And gradually you remove the scaffolding, as it were. So, to sum up there, delay free production until there's been a lengthy process of controlled input. I'd agree with that totally. Don't rush to production. That's when you get lots of mistakes, and that's when students feel they can't do it. That's when they lose their sense of self-efficacy and begin to think, I'm not very good at this. And keep in mind, from your knowledge of your class, is this class ready for this point of grammar? The NCELP in their training PowerPoints make this point now. Keep in mind, is this class ready? So, key recommendations then from the NCLP are those. Just have a look through. And they do at the bottom there suggest that you try to build on knowledge developed at Key Stage 2 in England. That's elementary schools, primary schools, up to the age of about 10 or 11. So I've spent some time there talking a bit about theory. I hope you find that interesting. In the next couple of presentations, we're going to look at more practical aspects. Now, how can we therefore incorporate grammar into lessons so that lessons aren't just dry explanations or dull repetitions of verb forms, so that we somehow mix in grammar to a communicative approach. And so we'll be looking at lexicogrammar, the oral situational approach, drilling, and grammar through listening. There are the references. I just point out there at the bottom, I wrote a blog on a summary of recent research about how we should teach grammar. You can find it at that address on my own blog. The TSC review, by the way, well worth a read. It's not very long, and it was chaired by Ian Borkham in 2016. And you can find that linked from the homepage of the ncelp.org site. So next time we're going to look at lexicogrammar, and just a little plug for books I've been involved in there, Breaking the Sound Barrier, where we do have a chapter devoted to parsing and the importance of grammar for listening, our main handbook called the Language Teacher Toolkit, and I've got some stuff on grammar in my Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher. And a plug for this book, also one of my favourite books on second language acquisition, How Languages Are Learned by Patsy Lightbound and Nina Spada. So that's a last recommendation. So thank you very much for listening through to that session on grammar, and next time we'll talk about lexicogrammar. Bye for now.